Middle-earth. It is the greatest fantasy world ever created. A world so vast, its history spans over tens of thousands of years. A creative work so deep, it took 2 lifetimes of Tolkien's to bring it all to publication. For those who have delved these depths, there is a fascinating debate that plays out. What among all Tolkien's writings should be considered canon? And what is merely worthy for academic study? Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the tricky nature of Tolkien's canon, the common viewpoints, and I'll share where I land on this debate. For those who may not know, the term canon refers to works that are held as true in a given category. One of the earliest uses of the term was in the 1700s to describe religious texts such as the Christian Bible, which differs from the Hebrew Bible and even the Catholic Bible. Where these books largely differ are in what writings they consider to be canon. In time, this term would come to be used across many fandoms with various media, from the Sherlock Holmes books by Arthur Conan Doyle to the films, games, and books of Star Wars. Canon has been debated by fans and decreed by rights owners the world over. And while Tolkien certainly has the former, it's been refreshingly absent of the latter. But more on that in a bit. To look at Tolkien's canon and the debate around it, we should first start at the beginning, where in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. During J.R.R. Tolkien's lifetime, he published a total of 4 books with connections to Middle-earth: The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, and The Road Goes Ever On, a book of sheet music accompanying a selection of Tolkien's Middle-earth poems. And for some fans, this is where the true canon of Middle-earth ends. With this view, only these works, fully written and published with Tolkien's direct involvement, count, so to speak, with everything else Tolkien wrote merely extra material, perhaps interesting to read and discuss, but completely non-canonical. While I can appreciate this viewpoint for its focus solely on works Tolkien himself published, and to be honest, its simplicity compared to my personal outlook, I think it has a major drawback. If we were to only look at the poems, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, even with the incredible depth provided by the appendices, we are disregarding an incredible amount of stories and lore written by Tolkien that add incredible depth and further significance to the events depicted in the original published works. So if we are bringing more writings under the umbrella of canon, the question becomes which ones, and where do we draw the line? Most of the remaining books relating to Middle-earth were published by J.R.R.'s son, Christopher Tolkien, whose work as literary executor of his father's writings is, in my opinion, quite simply one of the greatest achievements in literary history. In total, Christopher would publish at least 25 books of his father's writings over the course of his lifetime, and his work would help bring about even more. The first of his Middle-earth works would be The Silmarillion, published in 1977, 4 years after his father's death. This book, primarily containing tales from the beginning of Arda through the First Age, also includes bits on the Second and Third Ages, primarily focusing on Numenor and the Rings of Power. And right off the bat, Christopher would run into a similar problem that fans face, deciding which of Tolkien's writings to include, which to disregard, and what is cohesive with what could be seen as the core canon, the original published books. For those unfamiliar, The Silmarillion was a great dream of J.R.R. Tolkien to see published. In his letters throughout the years, he makes this quite plain, sometimes humorously so. In 1945, he told his publisher, Stanley Unwin, "As for larger work, of course, my only real desire is to publish The Silmarillion." In 1948, he replied to a schoolboy who had written asking about more details of the world from The Hobbit. "I am afraid you would not find any information about that in ordinary works of reference, since I possess all the documents, and publishers won't publish them. What you really require is The Silmarillion, which is virtually a history of the Eldalie, or elves, by a not very accurate translation, from their rise to the last alliance, and the first temporary overthrow of Sauron, the necromancer. That would bring you nearly down to the period of The Hobbit. We could go on about the history of Tolkien's attempts to publish the Silmarillion, but suffice it to say, it was a work very dear to him. The problem, when it came to Christopher's work on getting it published, is that his father never finished it. With the success of The Lord of the Rings, the ideal scenario was that Tolkien would fully flesh out the tales of the Silmarillion into their own books matching the narrative style of The Lord of the Rings. However, this would prove quite a big undertaking, as Tolkien felt he must first tackle fundamental elements of the world before being able to produce a final and definitive version of the Silmarillion. While he would do more essays and writings on Middle-earth in the years to come, he would obviously not come close to completing the Silmarillion. As an aside, it is when thinking on this that I often wonder, what if Tolkien had the luxury of modern writers, and after The Hobbit, had the ability to just be an author for 4 decades? It's hard to say what would have come from Middle-earth not being a side gig, but we can dream upon it. Instead, the vast quantities of Tolkien's writings would be left to his son, and Christopher would set to compiling a publishable Silmarillion using his father's writings from after The Lord of the Rings where possible, yet in some cases needing to pull from as far back as material from 1917 to fill in portions of the narrative where his father never revisited. Along with the assistance of Guy Gavriel Kay, Christopher Tolkien would also be forced in some cases to create narrative elements to bring it in line with the published core works. At the time, Christopher said, "In this work, the concluding chapters, from the death of Turin Turambar, introduced peculiar difficulties, in that they had remained unchanged for many years, and were in some respects in serious disharmony with more developed conceptions in other parts of the book. A complete consistency, either within the compass of the Silmarillion itself, or between the Silmarillion and other published writings of my fathers, is not to be looked for, and can only be achieved, if at all, at heavy and needless cost." Over my years in the fandom, I've come across folks who hold the core books plus the Silmarillion as the true canon. Setting aside the History of Middle-earth series and Unfinished Tales due to their writing plus commentary nature. However, I think this is arguably an even more flawed approach. The reason I spend so much time on the Silmarillion here is because it illustrates so well the challenge of nailing down a set canon when it comes to Tolkien. It was a challenge even for Christopher at times. As incredible and important of a work the published Silmarillion is, even that would have things in need of correction years later. One of the most famous examples of this is the parentage of Gil-galad. In the published Silmarillion, he is said to be the son of Fingon. However, in the History of Middle-earth Volume 11, The War of the Jewels, Christopher reveals that he was in error, and that his father seemed to have decided Gil-galad was the son of Orodreth, and that Orodreth was not the brother of Galadriel and son of Finarfin, but rather Finarfin's grandson and Galadriel's nephew. Speaking of Galadriel, Christopher would also share when publishing 1980's Unfinished Tales that her story is one fraught with inconsistencies over Tolkien's various writings. There is no part in the History of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, and it must be admitted that there are severe inconsistencies embedded in the traditions. Or to look at the matter from another point of view, that the role and importance of Galadriel only emerged slowly, and that her story underwent continual refashionings. So if canon as just the core books is discounting too much material, but there are contradictions across the vast writings of the Silmarillion, Unfinished Tales, the History of Middle-earth, and the Great Tales, what could be the answer to Tolkien canon? I suppose the reality of the situation is there is no definitive answer. However, I do have an approach that I personally try to take, and I think many others do as well. It's what I might call degrees of canonicity, where we acknowledge the various versions, but try to make the best decision of what takes the higher precedence by 1. Not contradicting the final published versions of the core works, and 2. Tolkien's latest or best word on the topic. Now, this is nothing new when it comes to interpreting Tolkien's writings. It's pretty much the approach Christopher took to publishing things like the Silmarillion. Oh, so I guess I'd go back and add a point 3, listen to Christopher. If he gives an indication that something was likely his father's preferred version, I'm not about to disagree with him. Using this approach brings me to my personal stances on things like Gil-galad's parentage, he is Orodreth's son and Finarfin's grandson, and the Blue Wizards. Rather than showing up in 1000 of the Third Age and failing their mission, I believe they came around the year 1600 of the Second Age, and played a role in thwarting Sauron's effectiveness in the East. Yet there is certainly a case to be made that some of Tolkien's writings, even if occurring later in his life, aren't as preferable as some of his earlier ideas to some fans. And as none of these were actually published by Tolkien himself, there is some level of merit to the idea that there's no guarantee he would have if given the chance. Perhaps it is summed up best in the book Tolkien's Legendarium, edited by Verlin Flieger and Karl Hostetter, where it says, "There are Tolkien's latest thoughts, his best thoughts, and his published thoughts, and these are not necessarily the same." What is considered Middle-earth canon has some level of debatability, though I can't imagine anyone arguing that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings aren't the bare minimum of canon. In the end, I am immensely grateful in a whole other way for the work of Christopher Tolkien. Rather than decree a set canon like other estates or companies have done across various other media, he instead dedicated his career to giving us everything. We get the early drafts, the later writings, and everything in between, all with his own commentary, giving us insights into the when, why, how, and what of each of these bits of Middle-earth, guiding us through his father's writings not simply as a final canon, but as a creative process. And at its core, perhaps a world where all of these things can be considered canon, or at least partially so. Like history itself, there may arise conflicting accounts, as these great tales were perhaps passed down through the generations of Middle-earth to our own. As Christopher says in the Silmarillion, "Moreover, my father came to conceive the Silmarillion as a compilation, a compendious narrative, made long afterwards from sources of great diversity, poems and annals and oral tales, that had survived in age-long tradition. And this conception has indeed its parallel in the actual history of the book. For a great deal of earlier prose and poetry does underlie it, and it is to some extent a compendium in fact, and not only in theory. In the end, while we certainly have a core of canon, fans would be missing out terribly if they were not to see the true creative genius of Tolkien, which played out over decades and various versions of numerous stories. Thus, what we have as Tolkien fans is greater than any canon that might throw out earlier drafts or previously unpublished works. What we have is the Legendarium, the masterpieces of J.R.R. Tolkien, the incredible career of Christopher Tolkien adding volumes upon volumes, and the work of incredible people like Hammond and Scull, John D. Ratliff, Douglas Anderson, Karl Hostetter, and Brian Sibley, which include Tolkien's own words. The Legendarium is vast, and while it does not always lend itself to determining a set canon, it is always incredible, and it is always Tolkien. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Nerd of the Rings.